It was supposed to be just another quiet morning at St. Alora's Hospital. A slow shift, a few routine check-ins, the steady beeping of machines and murmurs of visitors passing through white corridors. But for Nurse Camille, everything changed the moment a 17-year-old boy slipped through the automatic doors holding a worn-out backpack pressed tightly to his chest. He wasn't scheduled for a visit. He wasn't listed as a relative. Yet something in his eyes made her pause, like he was carrying more than just fabric and zippers. He asked where room 19 was, speaking so softly it barely registered. His hands trembled as he clutched the bag tighter, refusing help, insisting he knew the way. Camille watched him from the nurse's station as he disappeared down the hall, her instincts tugging at her, not with suspicion, but with something else. Something maternal. Protective. She had seen grief in motion before, but this felt different. 10 minutes later, she found a boy sitting beside a sleeping patient, a woman, frail and still, lost in the haze of medication. His head was bowed, the backpack at his feet, untouched. When she gently asked who he was, he stood slowly, handed her the bag, and said, "She won't wake up, but maybe this will reach her." His voice cracked on the last word. Then, without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked away. Camille stood frozen. It wasn't hospital policy to accept unregistered deliveries, especially not unsealed ones. But something about the weight of his words and the quiet ache in his eyes compelled her to open it. What she found inside was so unexpected, so deeply personal, it stopped her breath cold. Tears welled instantly, not from confusion, but from understanding. From the kind of recognition that bypasses logic and cuts straight through the heart. What could a teenager possibly carry into a hospital room that would make a grown woman drop to her knees in tears? What memory, what hope, what buried story had been zipped into that old canvas bag? And why did it feel like the boy had been holding it in his soul far longer than in his hands? The answer, and everything had changed, begins here. Camille didn't open the bag right away. She sat with it on her lap, stunned by the finality in the boy's voice. The way he had said, "Maybe this will reach her," like he was offering more than an object, more than a gift. Like he was offering a last attempt. She looked around the room. The woman in the bed was pale, her body nearly still under the weight of machines. The chart clipped to the end of the bed told her what she feared: terminal diagnosis. Late-stage glioblastoma. Time was running out. The zipper made a soft, deliberate sound as she pulled it back. What she saw first made her blink. Dozens of crumpled pieces of paper, some carefully folded, others worn thin for being held and reopened too many times. She pulled one out. It was written in pencil, shaky but passionate. The handwriting was young, raw. "I'm sorry I screamed at you that night. I was scared. I didn't want to lose you." Camille froze. She reached for another. "I passed the math test. You were right about Mr. Tanner. He is soft on the inside." Letter after letter, each more personal than the last. This wasn't just a backpack. It was a time capsule. A boy's unspoken relationship with the woman before her. His mother. His confidant. And maybe the person he couldn't say goodbye to out loud. The bag was full of moments he couldn't live without. Memories he needed her to have, even if she couldn't hear them. Even if the only voice she could still reach was the one made of paper and ink. There was something else in the bag, tucked deep into the bottom. A small, stuffed fox, worn, patched in places, eyes dulled from years of being loved too hard. A name was stitched across its stomach in fading thread. Charlie. Camille pressed it gently to her chest. She didn't know this woman. She didn't know this boy. But she knew what love looked like when it had nowhere left to go. And this bag was bursting with it. She stood beside the bed, hands trembling, and laid the fox near the woman's arm. Then she placed the letters gently across her chest, like a blanket made of memory. "He brought you everything he couldn't carry anymore," Camille whispered. "And everything he hopes you'll remember if you open your eyes." She didn't know if the woman could hear. But something in the room changed. A stillness gave way to something softer, something that felt like permission to hope. Camille stayed with her longer than she was supposed to. Shift change had passed. The hallway outside had quieted, and the humming of the machines now felt more rhythmic, less urgent. She found herself watching the woman's face, the slight twitch of her eyelids, the near imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. There was a kind of peace resting over her now, like maybe, Just maybe the presence of those letters had made their way into whatever space she was floating in. She couldn't stop wondering about the boy. How long he'd been carrying that bag. How many nights he'd spent writing those letters instead of sleeping. And most of all, why he had brought them now. Why today? Camille returned to the nurse's station and checked the visitor logs, but his name wasn't listed. No ID had been scanned. He had, in every way, slipped through, just like grief sometimes does. Quiet, unnoticed, until it's placed in your hands like a storm. The next morning, Camille came in early and went straight to room 19. The letters were still there, now stacked neatly on the tray table, the stuffed fox resting beside the pillow. And then she saw it. A new envelope, one she hadn't seen the day before. It was addressed simply to the nurse. She opened it with careful fingers, her heart thudding. Thank you for not stopping me. I know I wasn't supposed to be there. But she needed those words. I needed to give them. I've been writing them since the first day she forgot who I was. I just didn't know where to put them until now. You gave me that place. You let me say goodbye without forcing me to say it out loud. That meant more than I'll ever be able to explain. No name. No return address. But Camille felt her throat tighten. The boy didn't need to sign it. He had written his soul in those pages. She folded the letter and placed it alongside the others. Then she stood once more at the woman's bedside. You're more loved than you probably ever realized, she said softly. And he's still out there, carrying you, piece by piece, word by word. And now, you're carrying him too. Camille couldn't stop thinking about him. The boy who had come and gone like a shadow, leaving behind more emotion than most people manage in a lifetime. She didn't know where he lived, or even if he'd return, but part of her hoped he would. Not just for closure, but because she needed to tell him what had happened next. Because something had happened. Just hours after he left, the woman in room 19 stirred for the first time in nearly 3 days. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden gasps, no bright blinking eyes. Just the slow twitch of fingers, the barely there turn of a head. Camille had been checking vitals when she saw it. The woman's hand, resting near the stuffed fox, gently shifted until it touched the worn fur. It was so small, so fragile, that Camille thought she imagined it. But then the woman whispered something. Barely a sound. One word. Charlie. And the nurse nearly dropped her clipboard. A rush of emotion overtook her. Disbelief, awe, and something close to sacredness. It was a name, yes. But it was also a return. A bridge between silence and memory. The fox had meant something, and its presence had sparked something in her. Camille leaned closer, holding the woman's hand gently. He brought it for you, she whispered. He's thinking of you. Every word in that bag. It was for this moment. By the time the doctors arrived, she had fallen back into stillness, but something had changed. Her breathing was more stable, her vitals slightly stronger. It was as if her body, after being spoken to in the only language it remembered, love, had chosen, even momentarily, to hold on, to stay. Camille updated the chart and left a note for the on-call physician, but her mind was already racing ahead. She needed to find that boy. She returned to the nurse's station, scanning security footage from a morning before. He wasn't in any obvious shots, but she finally spotted a glimpse of him leaving the building. Head down, hands in his pockets, backpack now visibly empty. Camille paused the frame and printed it, a grainy photo of a boy vanishing into sunlight. She pinned it quietly to the bulletin board above her desk, not to investigate him, not to report him, but to remember him. Because what he brought wasn't a breach of protocol, it was a lifeline. A few days passed, and the woman's condition plateaued. She didn't wake again fully, but she remained steady, as though tethered gently by unseen threads. The letters stayed in her room, and the fox never left her side. Camille checked in on her often, not just as a nurse, but as someone who now felt personally woven into this story. She read the letters when no one was watching, not out of intrusion, but reverence. And in those words, she began to understand the kind of bond they'd shared. Not perfect, but profound. One letter stood out, dated nearly 3 years prior. I heard them say your memory might not come back, that sometimes it doesn't. But I still remember the night you stayed up with me when my fever hit 104. You read me that ridiculous fox story 3 times just to keep me calm. Even if you forget who I am, I'll keep remembering for both of us. Camille read it 3 times. then folded it back with trembling fingers and placed it beside the woman's hand. Later that week, a young woman in a gray sweater came to the front desk asking to visit room 19. She was listed as the patient's niece. Camille escorted her upstairs and gently asked, "Has the boy, her son, been in touch with you?" The niece frowned. "No, she doesn't have a son." Camille paused, confused. "He brought letters, a stuffed animal. He said she was his mom." The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "She's never had children. At least, not officially. She used to foster kids, years ago. She was known for taking in the ones no one else wanted." Camille's breath caught. Everything made sense in a single, staggering moment. The letters, the memories, the Fox story. He wasn't her biological son. He was a boy she had once taken in, maybe for a month, maybe for a year, but long enough to make a mark so deep it shaped him forever. And now, he had come back, bearing the only thing he had left, his memories. And in that realization, Camille felt something shift inside her. Not just awe, but an aching admiration. The kind of love that doesn't come from blood, but from being seen when you were invisible, from being held when the world had let go. That boy had come back to repay something she'd likely forgotten she ever gave. And in doing so, he reminded them all what it means to be remembered. Camille couldn't shake the weight of the revelation. The boy had never been listed in any records. No last name attached. No medical history logged. He had passed through this woman's life like a shadow, and yet what he carried, the letters, the memories, the Fox, had clearly changed the trajectory of his existence. How many children had passed through her home? How many had held on to her love like this? She went home that night and sat with a cup of tea, the hospital lights still flickering behind her eyes. She kept replaying the way he had stood in the room, silent, not needing to explain himself. He hadn't asked permission to grieve. He had simply given. And in that quiet gift, he had honored something sacred, the kind of mothering that comes not from biology, but from consistency, kindness, and presence. At work the next day, Camille spoke to the niece again, this time with gentler questions. "Do you know the names of the children she fostered?" The woman shook her head. "Not really. She wasn't supposed to keep track after they left. But I do remember one boy she called Fox. He was obsessed with this tattered storybook, The Quiet Fox in the Storm. She read it to him every night." Camille's heart stopped. That had to be him. That's why he'd chosen Charlie. That's why the Fox mattered. Camille later found the book tucked into a thrift store down the street. The cover was torn, but the title was unmistakable. She bought it, wrapped it in soft brown paper, and returned it to the woman's room. She placed it gently beside the letters, along with a note of her own. "He remembers everything you gave. He became someone because of it." And although the woman remained unresponsive, Camille felt a change in the air, as if something unspoken had been understood, as if the story had completed circle. And in that moment, she realized, not all goodbyes are meant to be heard. Some are meant to be felt, in pages turned, in names remembered, in quiet returns that ask for nothing but a place to leave what was never forgotten. That evening, as the sky turned lavender beyond the hospital windows, Camille sat alone at the nurse's station, thumbing through the pages of the old Fox book. The story was simple, almost childlike, yet profoundly tender. A little fox, lost in the middle of a storm, finds shelter under a tree where an old owl tells him, "Stay here until you are strong enough to find your way." The fox returns every year, even after the owl is gone, just to sit under the tree. Camille closed the book slowly, blinking tears she didn't expect. This boy Fox had returned his tree. Word quietly spread around the hospital. Not of the boy, exactly, but of the woman in room 19 and the notes beside her bed. Staff began visiting between shifts, reading one letter at a time, always in silence. A young orderly left a flower on her nightstand. A pediatric nurse, moved by the story, started bringing books to work, hoping to start a collection for foster children. Without anyone planning it, a small movement had begun, all sparked by a bag of letters and a stuffed fox. Camille kept hoping the boy would return. She checked the entrance logs daily, watched for his face in the crowd. But he never did. It was as if he had come only for that one moment, to deliver his history and step back into the world. But he had left a trail behind, soft and powerful, changing every person who came close to the story. One night, nearly 3 weeks after that first visit, Camille found another envelope tucked beneath the pillow in room 19. The handwriting was familiar, but the message was new. If she wakes up, tell her the fox found the tree again. And this time, he wasn't afraid of the storm. Camille pressed her hand to her chest, eyes damp, soul full. Because now she understood, the boy hadn't just brought a memory. He had delivered a legacy. The message stayed with Camille like a heartbeat. She carried it in her pocket, reread it during long shifts, and found herself whispering it under her breath when the ward fell quiet. He wasn't afraid of the storm. The words carried more than courage. They carried closure. Or at least the kind that doesn't need applause or final hugs. Just understanding. Just peace. Room 19 became something of a quiet monument. Patients and visitors passed without knowing the full story, but the energy was undeniable, softer, warmer. Nurses left folded paper cranes on the window ledge. Someone brought a small nightlight shaped like a fox and plugged it into the wall. No one claimed credit. No one needed to. The story had moved beyond names now. It had become shared. The woman remained stable, caught between sleep and wakefulness. Her condition hadn't improved drastically, but her body held on with a resilience no one could explain. Doctors attributed it to basic care and luck. But Camille knew better. She believed in the power of memory, of being spoken to, even silently, by someone who loved you with enough strength to return after years of silence. Then, one Sunday morning, Camille entered the room and froze. The stuffed fox had been moved, gently tucked under the woman's arm. Her fingers, thin and fragile, curled around it like muscle memory. And though her eyes remained closed, her lips formed a single shape. Home. No sound came out. No alert went off. But Camille placed her hand over the woman's and whispered, "He already knew you were." Word of the moment spread among staff like a secret blessing. Some called it a miracle. Others said it was the culmination of emotional resonance. But Camille didn't try to explain it. She just returned to the nurse's station, looked at the faded photograph of the boy walking away, and smiled. He had made it back to her. And somehow, even in silence, she had answered. Later that week, a social worker visited the hospital after hearing whispers of the story. She sat with Camille in the staff lounge, flipping through notes, letters, and copies of the boy's words. "I worked with placement records back then," she said. "I think I know who he is." Camille's heart caught. She hadn't even realized how badly she needed to hear his name. Not to find him, but to complete the circle. The woman placed a file on the table. It was thin. A faded photo paper clipped to the front showed a young boy, no older than 9, with sharp eyes and an awkward smile. The name on the file, Elliot Raymond Rowe. Fostered at age 8 by the woman in room 19. Stayed 9 months. Transferred, then lost track in the system. No adoption. No family. "Do you know what happened to him after?" Camille asked softly. The social worker shook her head. "Not officially, but I've seen what trauma looks like when it's unresolved. This," she gestured to the letters, the fox, the room. "This is resolution." He came back. He found her. Camille held the file for a long time. Not to open it, just to feel its weight. As if by holding it, she could say, "You were never forgotten." That night, Camille left a new book beside the bed. The Quiet Fox in the Storm, newly bound, with Elliot's name written inside the cover. Below it, in simple handwriting, "You changed his life, and he found his way back to you." She didn't know if the woman would ever fully awaken to read it. But some part of her, the part that had whispered home just days earlier, surely knew what had been returned. In a world full of unfinished stories and unspoken goodbyes, this one had defied the odds. Not with grand reunions or press releases, but with a backpack full of letters, a stuffed fox, and the quiet, powerful love of a boy who never stopped carrying the pieces of a woman who once gave him safety. Days passed with a quiet steadiness. Room 19 remained a place of quiet reverence, and Camille made it her ritual to stop in each morning. Not always to speak, sometimes just to sit beside the bed, her hand resting gently on the woman's. The letters stayed right where Elliot had left them, untouched by staff, guarded as sacred. And always, nestled beneath the blanket, was Charlie, the fox, worn and patient, a sentinel of memory. One evening, as Camille prepared to leave for the night, she noticed something unusual in the hallway. A bouquet of wildflowers, sunflowers, baby's breath, lavender, had been left in front of the door. No note, no vase, just tied with twine, fresh and vibrant. She brought them inside, placed them in water, and set them on the windowsill where the light from the sunset struck just right. It felt like another wordless message, like another chapter added to the story, without a single sound. That night, the woman stirred again. Camille was adjusting the foreline when the woman's hand gently grazed hers. Her eyes fluttered, not fully open, but searching. Camille leaned in. "It's okay," she whispered. "He was here. You mattered to him more than you'll ever know." A single tear slipped down the woman's cheek, not from pain, but from something far deeper. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Love, it turns out, leaves fingerprints on the soul. The next day, Camille wrote a letter of her own. Not for records, not for files, but for Elliot. She didn't know where to send it, so she placed it with the others, sealed, marked simply, "If he ever returns." Inside, she wrote, "You gave something no one else could. You reminded her who she was. And you reminded us who we're supposed to be." And even if Elliot never walked through those doors again, Camille knew the story had already moved beyond that building. His act had sparked something larger than a reunion. It had reminded every nurse, every visitor, every soul who passed by room 19 that love does not require permanence. Sometimes it only asks to be delivered, handwritten, carried, and quietly left behind. Weeks later, Camille received a small, square envelope in her staff mailbox. No postage, no handwriting on the outside. Just sealed with a pressed wax circle, the imprint of a fox's face delicately stamped in. Her breath caught. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single photo and a note. The photo showed a young man, perhaps 19 or 20, standing in front of an old oak tree. His face was more mature now, stronger, but the same searching depth lingered in his eyes. In his hands, he held the same stuffed fox. At the base of the tree, barely visible, was a small wooden sign. "For the woman who taught me how to stay." The note attached was no longer written in shaky pencil. It was clean, steady. "Dear nurse, I never knew her real birthday, but I celebrated anyway. The day I met her. The day she said, 'You're not broken. You're just waiting to grow.' I didn't understand it then, but I do now. You helped me return to her. And because of that, I learned how to return to myself." Camille sat for a long time, the letter clutched to her chest, the photo catching the morning light. She thought about all the patients she'd cared for, all the moments of joy and devastation. And she realized this was why she stayed. Not for the charts, not for protocols, but for this. For the moments where something intangible passed from one soul to another. A boy, a fox, a letter, a breath. And on her next shift, she placed the photo in a frame and set it quietly on the windowsill of room 19. The woman still hadn't spoken another word. But Camille didn't need her to, because somehow, in the deepest part of both their stories, everything had already been said. Room 19 became more than just a hospital room. It became a symbol. Staff spoke of it in hushed tones, not out of fear, but with reverence. New nurses were told its story during orientation, not as protocol, but as legacy. They learned about the boy who returned carrying words, and the woman who, even in stillness, responded to them. The fox remained on the bed. The letters stayed protected in a wooden box at the foot of it. No one dared to move them. They had become sacred text. Camille noticed that patients and families who had never met the woman often visited the room just to stand quietly at the threshold. Some cried. Others smiled. Many just breathed deeply finally. It wasn't just about the story anymore. It was about what the story represented. That even forgotten people can be remembered. That even temporary love can leave permanent imprints. That sometimes what seems like the end is just a pause, a waiting place for grace. One afternoon, a teacher from a nearby high school arrived asking for permission to share the story with her class. "One of my students brought it up," she said. "He heard about the letters. Said it changed how he sees his foster mom." Camille nodded slowly. She hadn't known that Elliot's story had made its way into the world. But now she understood. Some stories don't spread like wildfire. They root quietly, deeply, and bloom years later, unseen. The teacher left with copies of the letters. Not all, just a few chosen with care. And a message from Camille. Let them read what love looks like when it has nowhere left to go, and chooses to go anyway. That day, Camille sat beside the woman once again, reading softly from the quiet fox in the storm. The same passage she'd read so many times before. But this time, the air around her felt warmer, not from light, but from remembrance. And then, almost like a whisper caught in a dream, the woman moved her lips. Camille leaned close, heart pounding. A sound. Faint. Fragile. But there. Just one word. Elliot. Camille didn't cry. She smiled. Because some names are never forgotten. Not by the heart. Not by the soul. And not by the kind of love that returns, even when it's no longer expected. The days that follow were filled with small miracles. Not the kind that make headlines, but the kind that heal the spaces beneath scars. The woman, now known by name again as Marjorie, began responding more frequently. Not in full sentences, but in presence. Her eyes followed voices. Her fingers gripped hands. The fox never left her arms. And every time Camille spoke of Elliot, a tear would slip from the corner of her eye. That was more than memory. That was knowing. One evening, Camille found Marjorie sitting up, her head propped by pillows, gazing at the framed photo of Elliot. Her hand hovered just above it, not quite touching the glass. Camille sat beside her. He came back for you, she said gently. He said you were the first place he ever felt safe. Marjorie's lips parted slightly. Brought the fox, she whispered, barely audible. Camille nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. He did, and your words raised him. Camille updated the chart that night, but more than that, she wrote a personal note and added it to the box of letters. You remembered him, just like he never stopped remembering you, and that's all he ever needed. It was the kind of full-circle moment that rarely happens, but when it does, it changes everyone it touches. Marjorie, Camille, the staff, even Elliot, wherever he was, would feel the echo of it. A few weeks later, room 19 was needed for a new patient. Marjorie had stabilized enough to be moved to long-term care, and Camille accompanied her during the transfer. As they wheeled the bed out, staff lined the hallway in quiet honor. Not because Marjorie was famous, but because she was beloved. She had become proof that love planted in broken soil can still bloom years later. Before leaving, Camille returned to the room one last time. She looked around at the walls that had absorbed so much silence. So many unsent goodbyes turned into answers. She whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Elliot." Then she turned off the light, gently closed the door, and carried the box of letters into the next chapter, where stories don't end, they simply continue. In her new room, Marjorie adjusted slowly to the quieter rhythm of long-term care. The days were gentler now, filled with soft music, scheduled therapies, and brief but powerful moments of clarity. Camille visited whenever her shift allowed, often reading aloud from the letters, always with Marjorie's hand resting on the fox. Sometimes, when Camille would finish a line, Marjorie would nod, her eyes brimming with recognition, like each word was stitching her back together. Camille began noticing how other patients responded to the story. Those who rarely spoke began to listen. One man who had been unresponsive for weeks opened his eyes as Camille read aloud Elliot's letter about passing his math test. A woman with late-stage dementia clutched her own blanket a little tighter when Camille described how Marjorie once whispered, "You're not broken." The story had transcended its origin. It had become medicine. Inspired, the hospital's palliative care team asked Camille to create a storytelling initiative. She called it Letters for the Unseen. Families, volunteers, even staff could write letters to loved ones in comas, in confusion, or simply in silence. Words were placed by bedsides, read aloud, or tucked into hands. Elliot's story was the seed, and now stories bloomed on every floor. The letters became part of the daily rhythm. Volunteers would read for an hour each day. Some cried, some laughed, some simply sat in stillness. And though not every patient stirred, something unspoken passed through the air, a presence, a reminder that even in stillness, the soul is listening. And Marjorie, once lost in the fog, had become a quiet queen of it all, her story rippling into strangers' hearts like a lighthouse for the forgotten. One afternoon, Camille read her own letter aloud to Marjorie. You taught him to stay, and he taught us all how to return. You may not remember every word, but you became the kind of love that refuses to leave. And now, we get to carry it forward. In every voice, in every room, in every child who wonders if someone will ever come back for them. Marjorie smiled faintly. She couldn't speak much anymore, but her eyes closed gently, her hand tightening around the fox, as if to say, they already have. News of the project spread beyond the hospital. Local newspapers picked it up. A journalist wrote a feature titled The Boy with the Fox and the Nurse Who Listened, which quietly went viral. Messages poured in from around the country. Former foster children, caretakers, aging parents. Many asked the same question: where can I send my letter? Camille worked with the hospital board to create a permanent wing in honor of the project. It was called The Nest, a name chosen for its symbolism, a place of rest, of return, of belonging. Inside the nest, walls were lined with shells of stories. Every letter was preserved, not archived in sterile folders, but displayed in glass-front books, their pages always ready to be read. There were soft chairs, blankets, pens, and paper for those who needed them. And always, in the corner, a small plush fox sat beneath a light that never turned off. Camille eventually reached out to the journalist to ask if there had been any word from Elliot. The answer came back 3 days later, a forwarded message. Elliot had read the article. He didn't want to be interviewed, but he left a note. I didn't know anyone else would care. I just didn't want her to go without hearing me one last time. But now I see, she didn't just hear me. She became the voice for everyone who couldn't speak. In the mailroom, weeks later, a package arrived. No sender. Inside, a worn book, The Quiet Fox in the Storm, with a new inscription in the front. You helped the fox find his way, and now, he'll help others too. It was signed, simply, ERM. Camille placed the book in a glass case at the center of the nest. She stood back and let the moment settle. A story once whispered between a boy and a woman, now standing tall for all to see. And as she watched visitors pause in front of it, some in silence, others wiping tears from their cheeks, she knew this wasn't about one room or one letter anymore. This was a movement of memory. And it all started because one boy came back when no one expected him to. As autumn unfolded, the nest became more than a room. It became a ritual. People arrived not just to visit, but to confess. They brought boxes of letters, journals filled with years of unsent apologies, messages written by children, or final words from parents long gone. They came quietly, some alone, some with others, and they left with lighter hearts. The room did not judge. The room held. Camille, now unofficially called the Keeper of Voices, dedicated her time to guiding others through their stories. Not as a therapist, not as a healer, but as someone who listened. One day, a teenage boy stood frozen at the door of the nest, his hand shaking as he held a sealed envelope. Camille walked over and said, "You don't have to say anything. Just place it down. That's enough." He nodded, placed the letter beside the fox, and left with tears streaming down his cheeks. That letter would later be read by another young girl, just 12, who had also written a message she was too scared to deliver. It read, "If you ever wondered if you mattered, you did, even if no one ever told you." Camille watched the exchange with quiet awe. The words didn't belong to one person anymore. They had become a collective heartbeat, strangers writing for strangers, grief reaching for healing, one sentence at a time. Meanwhile, Marjorie's health began to fade more rapidly. Her body, after holding on for so long, seemed ready to rest. But her face remained peaceful, as though the letters had wrapped around her soul and told her everything was okay now. In her final days, Camille sat beside her every night. She read from Elliot's letters. She played soft music. And always, she placed Charlie, the fox, in her arms, just where he belonged. And then, one evening in late November, Marjorie passed quietly. No alarms, no final gasp, just a gentle stillness, her hand resting over a folded letter Camille had read aloud moments earlier. Her face looked younger, as if some part of her had gone back to that moment under the tree, where a little fox waited out the storm, knowing that someone still loved him enough to return. The hospital held a private service. Small, intimate, full of light. Staff members spoke. Patients whose lives had been touched by her story left flowers and notes. The room was decorated not with formality, but with meaning. Paper cranes made from letters, wildflowers like the ones left weeks ago, and at the center, Marjorie's chair, now draped in a soft quilt embroidered with a single word, remembered. Camille was asked to speak last. She stood before the quiet gathering, holding Elliot's first letter, the one that had started everything. Her voice didn't shake. It was steady, like the love that had carried through every page, every visit, every word. This woman, she said, may not have remembered every face, every name, but her love remembered them. And one boy, one fox, remembered her back. That is legacy. That is healing. That is the story we carry forward. After the ceremony, Camille placed the fox on a shelf in the nest, not as a relic, but as a continuation. A new plaque was added beside it, for the ones who stay behind, and the ones who dared to return. Visitors touched the glass gently, some bowing their heads, others whispering a quiet, "Thank you," without even knowing to whom they spoke. But they felt it. Everyone who entered that room left changed, not because of what they took with them, but because of what they were allowed to leave behind. Weeks later, Camille received another envelope in the mail. A photograph. Marjorie's quilt, now resting beneath a tree. In front of it, Elliot, older, eyes wiser, holding a new book in his hands. The caption on the back, "I read her story to foster kids now. They know who she is, and they know who they are because of her." Camille placed the photo inside the nest, beside the fox, beneath the letters. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself weep, not for what had ended, but for what had been made eternal. Because this story, born of silence, carried through paper, and sealed with memory, had become something much bigger than grief. It had become a home. Winter blanketed the city, and yet the nest never felt cold. Inside, a soft golden lamp glowed continuously, casting light across the shelves of letters that now reached from floor to ceiling. A steady stream of visitors continued, some carrying stories, others seeking them. Teachers brought students. Hospice nurses brought patients. Foster children, adoptees, mothers, sons. No one left empty. The nest had become what Camille always hoped it would be. Not a museum, but a sanctuary. One morning, a woman in her 60s came in clutching a thick notebook. She sat in the corner for over an hour, staring at the fox, tears in her eyes. When Camille approached, the woman whispered, "I was one of hers. I was 5. I never stayed long. But she sang to me when I couldn't sleep. I forgot everything else. But not that." Camille sat beside her, held her hand, and simply said, "She never stopped singing." As word spread further, the nest began receiving letters from across the country, and even abroad. A university in London requested a copy of Elliot's story for a trauma-informed care program. A non-profit in Brazil began translating the project into Portuguese. The words, born in one hospital room, had found their way into classrooms, therapy centers, shelters. Every envelope was archived with care. Camille no longer ran the project alone. She led a team of carriers of memory. And though Elliot never returned in person, his presence never faded. Each time someone left a letter that began with, "I never got to say this to," Camille thought of him. He had modeled something vital for the world. The courage to return, not to be recognized, but to restore. He had shown that one act of remembering could reawaken an entire life. That winter, a new sculpture was installed beside the nest. A bronze tree, with a single fox curled beneath it. At its base, a plaque read, "Some storms are survived not by strength, but by being loved enough to stay." Camille stood before it, hand resting over her heart, and felt the pulse of every letter, every whisper, every echo that had built this place. She knew now, this wasn't the end of story. This was the beginning of so many more. On the anniversary of Marjorie's passing, the nest hosted a candlelight vigil. Dozens came, some who had known her, many who hadn't, each carrying a candle and a piece of paper with a name. The room glowed with soft light and shared breath. Camille opened the evening with a simple phrase, "We are here tonight for every person who loved us once, and for the ones who taught us how to return." The ceremony wasn't scripted. It didn't need to be. People stepped forward one by one, placing their letters in a woven basket beside the fox. Some whispered as they dropped the paper. Others paused with trembling fingers, letting go as if they were releasing a part of themselves. A few children, too young to write, left drawings of trees, of homes, of small animals with wide eyes and open arms. At the end of the night, Camille read a new letter aloud. It had arrived anonymously 2 days prior. You never knew me, but your story kept me alive this year. When I felt forgotten, I remember the boy with the fox. When I wanted to disappear, I wrote my own letter. I didn't leave it behind. I read it to myself, and it made me stay. Thank you for teaching me how. The room fell silent. Not heavy, full. And then, without a word, one of the children walked to the sculpture and curled up at its base, placing a blanket around the fox's feet. Camille knelt beside them, tears glistening in her eyes. He's not cold, she whispered, but thank you for keeping him warm. As the candles flickered low and the letters were gathered, Camille looked out across the room. A room built from love that outlasted loss. A room where silence became song, where grief became legacy. And in that moment, she thought of Elliot, wherever he was, and whispered into the air, "You found your way home, and now there too." Spring arrived gently, as if the world itself were taking a breath after a long, quiet winter. The nest was now a cornerstone of the hospital, visited not only by those within its walls, but by people who traveled hours just to sit, to read, to feel. Camille often found herself walking the room at dawn, running her fingers across the spines of the letter books, tracing the names, the dates, the ink now fading into history. It was like walking through a sacred garden, one grown from grief, watered by memory. One morning, she found a new envelope, unmarked and sealed with a gold sticker shaped like a star. Inside was a letter written in simple, childlike script. "I never met the lady with the fox, but my mom said she saved a boy. That makes her a superhero. I wrote her a thank you, because now I'm not afraid to write my dad in heaven." There was no signature, just a crayon drawing of a little fox flying in the sky with a cape. Camille smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. The story was now reaching places even pain couldn't hide. Camille created a new shelf that week, one labeled Letters from the Young. She filled it with notes written by children, messages of forgiveness, hope, confusion, love. Some addressed to parents, others to siblings or imaginary friends they'd had to leave behind. The fox sat beside the shelf, a constant reminder that no message was too small, too late, or too strange to matter. Every word had a place. Every silence had a space to echo. One afternoon, a man in his 30s visited the nest and asked to speak with Camille. He didn't give his name at first, just stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes on the sculpture. "I was in the system," he said quietly. "Never stayed long anywhere. But I remember a woman who used to sing lullabies about storms and foxes. I forgot her name, but I never forgot how her voice felt." Camille placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Her name was Marjorie, and she remembered you." The man didn't speak after that. He just knelt beside the sculpture, laid a photograph of himself as a boy beneath the bronze fox, and whispered, "Thank you." Then he left. No name, no story, just another chapter quietly returned to the tree. Camille tucked the photo into the archives, knowing that one more piece had come home. The years passed. Camille grew older, her hair streaked with silver, her voice softer, but her presence just as rooted. She eventually trained a team of caretakers, not just nurses but story keepers, people who understood the power of quiet places and handwritten words. The nest expanded into other hospitals, schools, even youth centers. And in each one, the fox remained, a silent witness to the storms and to the children who outlived them. Elliot's story had become legend, though Camille always reminded new volunteers. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to remember her. And that difference, she believed, was what made it so powerful. His act of love was never for attention. It was pure. It was rooted. And it had grown a forest of healing around it. On the 20th anniversary of the first letter, a ceremony was held. Thousands of letters were on display. Survivors, children, families, and caretakers from every walk of life gathered to light candles and read excerpts aloud. Camille sat in the front row, Charlie the fox cradled gently in her lap. And when her name was called, she stood slowly, the room rising with her, not in applause, but in silence. A silence full of meaning. She didn't give a speech. She simply walked to the microphone and read one of Elliot's earliest letters, the one that began, "I'm sorry I screamed at you that night. I was scared. I didn't want to lose you." And when she finished, she said, "He didn't lose her. None of us did. She's right here. In every letter. In every hand reaching across time." That night, as Camille turned off the lights in the nest for the final time in her care, she looked at the shelves, the sculpture, the fox. She whispered one last message into the quiet. Some stories don't belong to us. They pass through us. And if we're lucky, they leave us better. And with that, she closed the door. And the light, as always, remained on. Some stories are not meant to end. They're meant to echo. What began with a teenage boy carrying a stuffed fox into a hospital became a living reminder that memory can outlive silence, and love can endure even the sharpest storms. This was never about grand gestures or perfect timing. It was about something far more powerful, the quiet bravery of remembering someone who once held you, and choosing to hold them, even when they no longer could. We live in a world that often forgets the invisible ones. The foster children, the silent caregivers, the patients who drift between names and numbers. But this story proves that no act of kindness is ever truly lost. Even years later, a voice can rise from a letter. A name can stir from beneath forgotten folds. And a heart, long buried in memory, can pulse again through the steady beat of a story shared, read, and passed forward. Elliot never wanted to be a hero. He simply came back to say what he never got to say, to leave behind the pieces of his love in the only way he knew how. And through that act, he gave all of us permission to speak what we've kept inside, to write, to forgive, to return. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from fixing what was broken, but from acknowledging that it mattered at all. So if you've ever loved someone silently, if you've carried words too long in your chest, let this be your moment. Write the letter. Say the name. Place the fox at the foot of the tree. Because the truth is, you don't need to be remembered by many to change the world. Sometimes, it only takes one person, one memory, one letter left behind to keep a legacy alive. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share in the comments what this meant to you, or who you're remembering today. Because your story, just like Elliot's, may be exactly what someone else needs to hear to begin again.